right, it's good to see you, Ken, and several of the others. It's like going back. Amen. I really like the changes. I love the worship service, everything. Now, the topic I'm going to be speaking on is the Bible and ethnicity. And I'm going to use the African American experience because if we went through all of them, we wouldn't get out by 11:30. In fact, just going through this, you have to piece out certain things. But I think there's certain things you'll find that are interesting. There's always been two forces in American history from a racial standpoint, and that is segregation, which was the bread and butter of American society, but the opposition to it, which oftentimes took a lot of hard work and bloodshed. But those two forces have both been considered American, patriotic, and to some degree Christian. And so what I want to do is I'm going to go through certain points, and I'm going to kind of analyze and give some conclusions as we're going through and near the end of where we stand as Christians. All right, I'm going to start at the time right before the Civil War, or I should say right before Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln was making some statements on race because he had an anti-slavery foundation. That was his platform. And so many people in the South were so incensed that he would be anti-slavery, then they thought he might be pro-civil rights. And he made his statements that he has not nor ever has been in favor of the equal equality of black people. So he made that very clear. He simply also stated that the fact that he doesn't necessarily want them to be enslaved doesn't mean he has to really go in and marry them or get in close with them. So he had what we would call today a pro-segregation platform for an historical situation that involved the enslavement of people. Now, America is very unique and different because America has come out in many ways from many people to be a Christian nation. And yet, I don't remember any time in history that a Christian nation actually enslaved a group of people for no other reason than to have them in bondage. And so it's very unique. When you look at Exodus chapter 1, you will see that there was a new king that rose up in Egypt who knew not Joseph. He didn't follow the previous Pharaoh's administration policy of doing right by the Hebrews. And so he enslaved them, and he made their way hard. And he was afraid because they were outpopulating the Egyptians. And so he knew that in case of war, they can easily be baited over to the enemy's side, fight against Pharaoh, and get up out of the land and not be slaves anymore. So his policy was to burden them further. Now, it was different and yet very similar to the American slave situation or the trade situation, in that America wanted to burden the slaves in order to keep them where they were, to build what they needed done. Now, this has created since a quagmire of issues and problems, both for society and the church. And so Abraham Lincoln made these statements, and you'll see them in 1858, Charleston, South Carolina, when he's going against Douglas and he's making debates. He's making comments on these things. Now, they thought that was too radical. The very fact that he would still be anti-slavery. But he was anti-slavery on the position of amalgamation. In other words, in slavery, there was too much a mixing of the races because slave masters had free reins over their slave women. And so you were having what we would call biracial children now, and they would have those children back then. And so Abraham Lincoln said that if we didn't have slavery, it would limit that. There would be less mixing of the races. And he said that openly. And so that became one of the platforms, and yet he was considered extremely radical. And so his position on anti-slavery was so extreme in that day, and he said it. He said, I've never met a man, and he was at least 50 years old at the time. He told us his age. He said, I've never met a man, woman, or child that thought differently, which is very interesting because Abraham Lincoln was a smart guy and he was well-traveled. And for him to make that statement, you knew that that was the regular way of thought in this country. Now, jettison Once the Civil War enacted, which was oftentimes put under the banner of states' rights, but it was really fought over the right to have slaves. It was a horrible bloodbath, a tremendous bloodbath over this situation. Fathers against sons, cousins against cousins, brothers against brothers, killing over this matter. Now, after this Emancipation Proclamation, there was a Civil Rights Bill enacted in 1870, and there was protection because now you had Reconstruction. What are we going to do after this? Slaves are free, but where are they going to go? How are they going to live? How is America going to adjust? How are we going to evaluate what's going to be done where? That was called Reconstruction. And so there were soldiers, and I'm jettisoning to 1877, well, actually 1876, 1877, shortly after the Emancipation Proclamation, where Reconstruction was in force. There was an American election between two presidents, Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. Samuel Tilden was the Democratic nominee, and of course, Rutherford Hayes was the Republican. Long story short, their votes practically tied. Tilden was way ahead, but by the time you counted all the electoral votes, it came out to be very close. So this thing went on for a little bit, trying to choose who was going to be the president of the United States. This process was going on, and while it was going on, there were people from Rutherford Hayes' side, who were Northern Republicans, who went down and had a secret meeting with the Southern Democrats who were on Tilden's side, and they brokered a deal. And the deal was, we're going to let Rutherford B. Hayes be the president. But one of the stipulations was that the soldiers that were to enforce the reconstruction and protection of black people in the South were to be removed because they were growing tired of Reconstruction. Those soldiers were removed. The Ku Klux Klan, which came about at the foundation of the Emancipation Proclamation, wreaked havoc on blacks in the South. Lynchings, beatings, killings, murders. Free to do it. Now, jettison just a little bit ahead, this sparked what is called the Great Migration. Now, the Great Migration is really from 1916 to about 1970. And this is why many people think that systemic racism doesn't exist. It's already been done. People are bringing it up. So I just want to bring up some of these cases. As this is going on at the turn of the century, segregation began to rule. You didn't have slavery, but you had things put in its place. Vagrancy laws, grandfather clauses, Jim Crow laws. These were laws to establish a slavery without calling it slavery. Vagrancy laws were designed against black men, that it was a criminalized act if you could not have a job. So people were being arrested, put in prison, and then it became another way of economically grooming people because now you have this free slave labor that you can use for yourself. They can never get out, and they had to keep paying and to do what they're doing. You had all of these other laws put in, these codes that were designed to restrict black people moving up and moving ahead. Do you know those laws continued all the way up to 1954? The Jim Crow laws went all the way up to that point. And then we introduced the Supreme Court 1954 decision, and that's Brown versus the Board of Education. In the Brown versus Board of Education case, this case was to say separate is not equal. And it was moving in the way of integration as far as the educational things were concerned. So now this Brown versus Board of Education caused a lot of problems because right before that you had not only those vagrancy laws, the black codes and all of these things, but you also had housing restrictions. This is what was called redlining. It still exists, in fact, but redlining started strongly in 1934. Now, what is redlining? Redlining is choosing out districts, marking them out as safe or risky. In other words, dividing whites from blacks, making sure blacks are in neighborhoods that are separated and whites are in other neighborhoods. And then federal housing administration laws were put in place to be able to give loans to those in white neighborhoods and to restrict loans from those in black neighborhoods. Because everybody knows owning a home is how you build wealth. You're able to use it for things, you're able to use it for collateral, you're able to send your kids to college, you're able to do this. Now, these redlining codes were very significant. You will see that the realtors, I should say the FHA manual up until 1950, they had in their manual that you could not ever sell a home belonging to a white person to a non-white. It was written in the manual. In 1934, the Code of Ethics of the Underwriters also put in that groups that were of different races should never be allowed to live together. Now, these are systemic forms of racism. Now, of course, that moved things because the Great Migration is when blacks, which were majoritively in the South, were moving north. They were being terrorized, so they're moving up. They want better jobs. They want better homes. They want better schools. This brought out another problem because segregation was very strong against that. White people didn't want them moving into their neighborhoods. They didn't want them going to their schools. Integration was the end of America in their minds. And so they fought it. Police began brutalizing people. They began enforcing things. It became a very hard situation. Still, that type of thing persisted. Now, this went all the way up. Jettison up to the 1954 case, and right after that, the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement started to be enacted. Martin Luther King, the nonviolent sit-ins, the protests, the Freedom Riders in the South. All of these things were converging. Then, on top of that, shortly thereafter, the Vietnam War. So you have the civil rights protest combined with war protests. America was a shambles. Pressure was on the presidents. John F. Kennedy did not want to get involved at first, but later he jumped into it and started to preach, I would say, on civil rights. After he was assassinated shortly thereafter, Lyndon B. Johnson took over. Now, this is very interesting. Lyndon B. Johnson himself was a Southern Dixiecrat. Now, you have to know a little bit about the history of the parties. The Democrats, the Southern Democrats, especially the extreme ones, they were called Dixiecrats. They were totally against integration. They were totally against blacks moving in. Totally. They were dedicated to that. Some of the northern ones weren't as dedicated to that degree, but many empathized, and some totally opposed it. But at any rate, while this was going on, Martin Luther King, all of these things were moving in. It was a very turbulent time. Lyndon Johnson in 1964 put in the Civil Rights Act, which was almost 100 years after it had originally been put in, but you always had pushback. There was always pushback. Then he enacted in 1965 the Voting Rights Act, where blacks had the right to vote. Now we're moving all the way up into my generation, because I remember these things. Now, Strom Thurmond was a strong senator from South Carolina, and he was there for many years, and he was a strong leader, and he was a strong Dixiecrat, which opposed all of this integration laws and all of that type of thing. He was so incensed when Lyndon B. Johnson are giving these rights out that he decided to leave his party. So he left the Democratic Party and he joined the Republican Party. Many others from the Dixiecrat Party joined too. And this is what was called later the Southern Strategy, where presidents would appeal for the Southern votes to get them, to appease them, that they can have some of their rights. It became very prominent, especially during the Ronald Reagan era. President Trump really built up on it in more recent times. And even before that, Richard Nixon. They were able to appeal law and order, having your rights. Now, these things sound very normal, but when you knew what the situation was, it was telling them, oh, we're going to be able to do what we need to do and not have us integrated with all of these other ill effects. So when he moved up there, it changed the way the Republican Party did things. So the Dixiecrat force moved into the Republican Party, and the Democrats took over and started going the other way. They turned against the things that they formerly did, especially after the 1960s, in that way. And so the parties kind of became inverted to a certain degree when it came to social rights and civil rights and all of this. Now, this incensed a lot of people. In the 1970s, of course, and this is right after the prayer has been taken out of the public schools in the early 60s, and also in the 70s, you're seeing Roe versus Wade that came about, the Supreme Court decision to legalize abortion. All of these things were happening. But there was a case in terms of segregated schools, Green versus Connolly, 1971. The Supreme Court had already ruled that you could not have schools that segregated on the basis of race. But what was happening during the redlining era, 30s all the way up through the 60s, there was what we would call segregation academies. Whites who didn't want blacks in their schools, they were bringing up schools everywhere as an alternative to have to deal with this desegregation situation. So they were having their own separate schools. Well, in Mississippi in 1971, a black family, they saw where these schools were segregating against them. They took it to court. It ended up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that's correct, that you cannot have schools that segregate on the basis of race and still receive public funding. You can't do it. When that case hit the fan, it incensed many of the Southerners. Jerry Falwell, who was the founder of Liberty University, he was one that was outraged over this. The moral majority movement was coming up around that time, and he became the leader of that movement. A man by the name of Paul Weyrich, he was the leader behind the movement. And when the Supreme Court made that case evident, then that's what outraged them. And so they had meetings to see how they were going to approach this. And Paul Weyrich says you cannot use the language of segregation because segregation was already outlawed. But he says you can use the language of taking away our religious freedoms. Now you have to know this history to kind of get an idea where things are going. And so that became the movement. The moral majority movement segued into what is known as the Christian right. Now that was in 1979, and it's moved on from there. Now why am I saying these things? I'm saying these things because as I see American history and I see Christianity, I see that these opposing forces never went away. It was not like we settled it and it's gone. Many people say that. That's not been true. It's still there. We've made progress, but it's still there. Point, counterpoint. Point, counterpoint. It's always there, it just changes its name, it turns, it fights. But you have to understand that both sides were considered American. Both sides were considered patriotic, and both sides, to a great degree, were considered Christian. Christians divided over this race issue. They divided over the slave issue, and then when that was done, they divided over the segregation issue. But most empathized at least with segregation to some degree. They feared what integration would do, and they really want to be able to govern themselves without having to follow these rules. This is why they oftentimes disobeyed the Supreme Court decisions. Do you know in 1954 when you had the board versus education, That whole situation in 1954 was settled by the Supreme Court. In 1956, a year after I was born, many of the states vowed to pick up Jim Crow. And many of them added 50 more Jim Crow laws to the ones they used to be. So you can see this is not just an ancient issue, and it's not just an occasional issue. It's a consistent issue. The nomenclature changes, the difficulties are there, but it's still part of the American process when it comes to race and discrimination. Now, what does this say about Christianity? What does this have to do with Christianity? Well, it's not really about Christianity in the true sense, because Christianity in the true sense says that God's will is above all other things. And obviously other things have taken place. And we're putting patriotism, we're putting America, we're putting our own values, whatever they are, good or bad, above it. And to that degree, it's going to stifle everyone. As a Christian, you are called to serve God and tell the truth. And you are also called to live for God regardless of what it means. Just tell it the way it is. Don't give a false view of it. Don't put some truths in and deny others. Just speak it for what it is. That battle is still going on. It's not only going on politically, it's going on racially, it's going on religiously, because they're all tied together to some degree. And this is what is usually not articulated. You have people from one side saying this, people from another side saying the opposite, and trying to persuade you whichever way they stand. But both sides are going to have some good points, and both sides are going to have some evil points. But a Christian doesn't adopt that as an ethical way to go. A Christian is going to say the truth and let the chips fall where they may. But they're going to look at things the way they really are. So all the way up from that point, and we could go further, if Abraham Lincoln was correct in what he said, and he was a well-traveled man, you go back to the beginning of his life, you're in the 1800s, early 1800s, you go back not far from there, you're in the Revolutionary War, and you go back a little ways from there, and you're back at the time of the original slave trade. Now, there are always people of all races in this country and outside this country that are Christian first. But the culture is going to buy you into things that are going to mix culture and religion together and make you buy the package. Because that's what it is. And you have to stand to say what's right and what's wrong and be consistent with it. And in order to do that, you're going to have to give up something. You're going to have to give up your rights to think in a certain way. I often think about 1 Kings chapter 3 with King Solomon. Do you remember when God had given him great wisdom? And the first test of his wisdom was two prostitutes. They both had delivered children within weeks of each other. They both had those children. Overnight, one lady accidentally laid on her child and killed it. And in the middle of the night, she went up, took her dead child, put it in the other woman's arms, and took the live child. And then when they woke up in the morning, the prostitute who had the dead child finally realized, that's not my child. And so now this case goes to Solomon, which is kind of unusual because who takes cases like that? And as they go to Solomon, how are you going to determine the truth? They were both saying the same thing. The dead child is hers, the live child is mine. They both were very dramatic about that. They both had the same credibility. They were both prostitutes. There was nobody else there to corroborate one way or the other. So how are we going to determine which way is right? And so what they did, Solomon couldn't determine it. So he said, and I believe the Lord gave him that wisdom in that moment, bring me a sword. And when he's bringing the sword, he says, I'm going to cut this child in half. I'm going to give you half, and I'm going to give you half. And immediately the testimonies changed. When the truth and the lie look just alike, under certain auspices, you see the distinction. And so immediately the true mother said, no, give her the child, don't harm it. Now, she didn't want to give her child away, but she would rather do that than have it killed. The other lady said, no, let's do it the way he said. Let's be fair. 50% of the child you, 50% mine. Her rights to have the child and to win was greater than the child itself. Now, Christians are always in this world. You're in this world where you have options, but the options are sometimes limited. And in order to do the right thing, you're going to have to be willing to forsake and sacrifice something. But you do it for the cause of what's right. You do it for the cause of Christ, because the cause of Christ outweighs my own thinking. It outweighs everything else. There are certain things that are wrong to do, and you just don't do them. You don't cross those lines. I've observed that through the history, when you look at the abortion issue platform, for those who are pro-abortion, this is my body and I have a right to do, is identical to the pro-slavery platform. This is my property. I have a right to do what I will. And whoever takes away that right is going to have some trouble. I see the two as identical. They came from different eras. They come on different sides of the fence. But it's the same issue. Now, you can't buy into it on either side of the fence, because the politics of evil are evil. The politics of good are good. But what I'm seeing is that they're all mingled with some type of compromise evil, but they're trying to promote it as all good. And that's on both sides. What makes it really worse is when those who are Christian are doing this. And let me tell you, there are quite a few. There are many who have told me to my face that systemic racism does not exist. Now, I'm not pushing racism. I'm just calling it what it is. The fact that it has always showed up in these systems and continues to proves that it's systemic. Now, does everybody for it? No, but enough is for it that it tends to always have a big fight. It tends to keep things divided. It tends to keep things off kilter. And it tends to be compromised with. Well, it's the same on the left and right side. The Christian is the one God is looking at to articulate it. But in order to do that, you're going to have to stand aside. And you're going to have to stand on the side of right where the deviation comes. And all Christians should think like this. What's right all the way around? Segregation is wrong. Aborting children is wrong. Discriminating is wrong. Don't play one side to the other. Because what happens is you lose your moral voice to speak. And I think that's what's happening. The church, in those ways, are losing their moral impact in this society because it's mingled with this era. And in order to get it back, you can't just force it. You can't just politicize it. And you can't just mobilize, which is the efforts that are going on. We can get it. We can do this. We can do that. All of it's not right. Some of it is. But all of it isn't. And we're not owning up to that which isn't right. And what happens over time, biblically, is that God stops listening to you. He shut up his ears against Israel because Israel wasn't listening to the prophets. And the prophets were covering some of these same issues we're dealing with today. Israel didn't hear. They thought as long as they had the temple, they were God's people. They had God's promises. No matter what they did, God was on their side. Very eerily similar to the American idealistic political rhetoric. But God is looking for people who are on his side. The best thing you can do for any society, for your family, and for eternity is to stand right with God. And this is why as Christians you want to take seriously how you interpret the Bible. And then you have to look at the issues and see how they really are. Jesus was always looking, and he could always tell there was one right answer to every situation. But you had to correctly see the problem. I think in many ways we miss seeing the problem for whatever reason. Maybe purposeful at times, maybe accidental, maybe ignorant. A lot of it is based upon the narratives we're constantly listening to that don't give the right full side. But the point of the matter, to that degree, we miss the problem and we miss getting God's ear to the solution. God is looking to correct us. And so I think that's the way a Christian should approach these issues. First, assess the problem. Does that mentality exist? Yes. Is it persistent? Yes. Is it oftentimes called Christian? Yes. Is it right? No. How do we approach it? Where is your place in history? What do you do now that you're taking in now, the 23rd, 21st century? What are you going to do? How are you going to approach it? Rarely do you see an articulation where people tell the whole truth the way it is and still stand on the side of God completely without being a compromised situation. Just like the compromise in the presidential election of 1877, that kind of prefigures the compromise situation as regards to discrimination in the United States historical pattern. So the pattern of what we're seeing, some things are new, but that pattern is consistent. You can trace it. It's consistent. And we have to remove that element by serving the Lord. And it's going to take a lot of bravery to do that. But God is with you. And if God be with you, who can be against you? God bless you.